It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker to you today. David K. Jordan received a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 1969. His academic interests center in cultural and psychological anthropology, sociolinguistics, and the cross-cultural study of religion. Regional interests focus on Chinese society, especially Taiwan, with a secondary interest in pre-Columbian Mexico. Jordan has published on language, social structure, folk religion, and sectarianism in Taiwan and China, and has written in and about Esperanto and the social movements associated with it in the associated area of interlinguistics. His recent courses have concerned Taiwan, China, and pre-Columbian Mexico, as well as the ethnography of Christianity. He has also taught the first quarter of Eleanor Roosevelt College's core sequence, Making of the Modern World, in most years since the college was founded. Jordan joined the anthropology faculty at UCSD in 1969. From 1994 to 2004, he also served as provost of Earl Warren College. Professor Jordan retired in 2004, but continues actively teaching Making of the Modern World, as well as in the department. Welcome now, Professor Jordan.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk about Taiwan. It's always a pleasure to talk at all. Now that I'm retired, I don't have classes anymore except for an occasional freshman seminar. The upcoming one is actually going to be, there's one about Taiwan. I tend to have a lot of slides and I tend to go on and on and on. So I'll keep an eye on the clock, but I will also flip through a large number of slides. In general, with PowerPoint presentations, I like pictures rather than text. And this time I have more text than I would probably like, but I will try to confine that and mostly be pictures. Okay, now let me see. We have a way to share the video here, share screen, and here we go. Is this duly shared?
It's coming up. Yes. You're not yet in presenter mode.
But we're not in presenter mode. Okay, we're going to go and.
There you go.
All right. Very good. And I'll get my screen adjusted a little bit. Sometime back, there's an old joke that was who's on first? Who's on first? It's who. It's one of these bilingual jokes. And I used it sometime, I don't know, 15 years ago to talk about the changing concept of ethnicity, the changing sense of identification in Taiwan in the context of the changes in Taiwan history. And it turns out that students who take my Taiwan classes are oftentimes unaware that Taiwan used to be part of Japan, that Taiwan was actually given away by the Chinese emperor, that at one point there was a proposal to give Taiwan to the Dutch because who needs it with this place and things like that. So this is going to be very historical, but at the same time, I want to give you a sense of the situation in Taiwan at the present, the evolution of Taiwan since the Second World War and its fantastic development, and the growth of population in Taiwan and who they think they are, who they feel they are. Some of the illustrations come from a book called The Minor Arts of Daily Life on popular culture in Taiwan that I edited jointly with Andrew with Andrew Morris and Mark Moskowitz, two alumni, the first in the history department, the second in the anthropology department from UCSD several years ago. And I've taken some of the pictures that various contributors to the book contributed to that book as some of the fodder for this lecture. So I want to acknowledge that the book itself is rather obsolescent, if not obsolete at this point. The term the minor arts of daily life was picked because we wanted to stress not the politics of Taiwan, but the way in which people live their lives, the ordinary things that are going on. And one of the things that Americans think of about Taiwan is that it's merely a political entity. It's invented in Washington somehow, and there's nothing else about it. So what I want to focus on especially is the sort of everyday life of Taiwan. This is the coast of China, as seen from a satellite, with Fujian province on the left, Taiwan, the island on the right of the screen, right up in here. And there's some clouds in the way. Notice these very high mountains. These mountains are the highest mountains to the east of Tibet. These are mountains. Somebody remarked that if you were to channel all of the runoff when it was raining and turn it into hydroelectricity, you could power all of East Asia on it. These are extremely high, about 10,000 feet and above. And the runoff has generated along here a coastal plain over the centuries, and this becomes the area of primary settlement. It was agriculturally very fertile, as runoff would be. Taipei, the present capital, is up in this area, which is actually the intersection of two river basins, which produces smog problems, by the way. So let's look a little further here. Here's a little clearer map of what we're up against in these mountains, rather than the picture from above. And the cities that I'm not going to talk about cities for the most part. Taipei is up at the north. Here's the picture on this piece. Here's the picture down here. My initial field work, most of my field work was down in this area. Part of Taiwan as a political entity is this little island group in here, which counts as a county in Taiwan, and two tiny islands little tiny archipelagos really, off the coast of Fujian, which are administered from Taiwan as well. That's an historical accident of the Second World War. If you look at this, these are the high mountains. This is the coastline. This is a place that is not just apartment buildings. I get students in my Taiwan classes that will say, "Oh, I'm Taiwanese. I'm from Taiwan. I go back to Taiwan every summer, and I sit in my parents' air-conditioned apartment on the 22nd floor and watch television the whole summer." And they're unaware that Taiwan even has beaches, that it has mountains. The flat land, that's the agricultural land, is rather scarce. And as the population grows and more land is taken up for industrialization, there's less and less farmland available. So farmland has to be very efficiently used, and indeed it is. When I was in Taiwan at the beginning of my visits to Taiwan, which was in the 1960s, people were still plowing with oxen. There are very few functioning water buffaloes anymore, but they were quite common. That was the usual way in which people plowed. And there was an awful lot of individual work. These are village pictures that I took in the 1960s. Let me give you a quick overview of history. We have sort of about 5 periods in Taiwan history. One is the prehistoric one up to the Qing Dynasty. There was a population, I'll get to it in a second, but they were primarily not Chinese. The Qing Dynasty in China lasted for almost 300 years, beginning in 1644. It's sometimes called the Manchu Dynasty, and it went up and was finally overthrown in 1911. In Taiwan, it didn't start until later. We'll get into that in a second. And it ended a little earlier. We'll get into that in a second. The reason it ended earlier is because Taiwan was ceded from the Chinese emperor to the Japanese emperor in 1895. And for the next 50 years, it was administered as the first Japanese colonial area. The Japanese actually sent a delegation to the United States to find out what they did about Aboriginal Aborigines, and they set up Indian reservations effectively in Taiwan for the non-Chinese population. And Japan was undergoing, as you know, a militarization during this period, culminating in the Second World War. An important fact is that Taiwan's Japanese period began before the Chinese government was overthrown in 1911 and the Republic of China founded, which means that Taiwan missed out on things like the establishment of the school system. It missed out on a great deal of political tumult in mainland China during that period. It missed out on that whole warlord period business. It missed out on the Republic of China early governmental reforms of every kind, the institution of elections and the creation of a modern style of government. That didn't happen in Taiwan. It was under Japanese rule at the time. At the end of the Second World War, Taiwan reverted to the Republic of China. Now, it had never been part of the Republic of China. It had been part of the Qing Dynasty, but it reverted to the Republic of China, that 1911, 1912 Republic of China. And it was put under martial law almost immediately. So we can call this the sort of ROC martial law period that went up until 1987. The contemporary period begins with the end of martial law. It's still the Republic of China, but the political structure changes a little bit. So these are our major periods. Whoops. Where was I? Hit the wrong button here. Okay, that prehistoric period is much more prehistoric than one might think. It appears that a good deal of the South Pacific may have been populated from the coast of Southeast Asia or of East Asia through Taiwan. There are various migration routes into the islands of the Southern Pacific. But there are archaeological sites that date back very, very early in Taiwan. The population that would have been there would have been the population, the descendants of which are the so-called Aboriginal tribes of Taiwan today. They're a small part of the population, but with these very deep historical roots, which archaeologists are still trying to trace. They're divided into a number of different groups. Sometimes the names change a little bit. The map at the right of your screen shows a distribution of these in various parts of Taiwan. And the classification and the stabilization of the names is basically done in the Japanese period. So 1684, Taiwan became part of Fujian province. I said that the Qing Dynasty began on the mainland a little bit before it did in Taiwan. The reason is it followed the Ming Dynasty, and the Ming Dynasty left behind a residuum of supporters of the old Ming Dynasty, concentrated especially in Fujian province. So the Qing Dynasty had to fight its way down to the coast, and this Ming loyalist sentiment eventually ended up focused in Taiwan. So the 1600s to the 1800s, Taiwan was a wild and woolly frontier. And we can think of that as basically the 1700s and 1800s. I'll get to that. 1885, it became a province because its population was justifying its separation from Fujian. 1895, as I mentioned, it was ceded to Japan. 1945, returned to China. 1949, the ROC central government, driven out of China, moved to Taipei. And finally, 1987, martial law ended. And sometime we're going to resolve the relationship between Taiwan and China, but this is still not resolved. So let's start with this wild and woolly frontier. This Ming-Qing transition that I mentioned, in 1623, the Dutch were expanding an empire. They had taken over in Indonesia. They had founded Batavia. They were trying to get a foothold in China. And eventually, under pressure from the Europeans, the weakening Ming Dynasty finally ceded the island of Taiwan to Holland. They were having a bit of a giggle over this, the Chinese were, because they had never claimed the island of Taiwan. So what they were doing was taking a bit of useless land, this island off the end of everything that nobody had ever claimed, and we'll let the Dutch have that and they'll think they have a foothold in China. The Dutch administered this, tried to set up, they tried to encourage immigration, and they tried very hard to set up an agricultural base with lots of Chinese immigrants coming in to run it. There were constant rebellions against them, both by the Chinese immigrants, but also by the Aboriginal peoples being displaced by these immigrants, especially from the flat coastal regions as opposed to the mountain regions. Finally, in 1644, the dynasty collapsed, and a man we know in English as Qing established a kingdom in Taiwan that was his own kingdom. He was, some people describe him as a pirate. As the new government took over, the child emperor was under the control of a eunuch advisor whose view was that all these pirates like Qing along the coast needed to be expunged. And so there was a declaring of a Fujian coast evacuation. Along the coast of Fujian and this province to the south of it, Guangdong, people were not allowed to live at the coast. They were forced to move inland, but there was no place for them to go inland. So evacuating the coast produced a flow of refugees, which increased the number of people living in Taiwan from Fujian, and also stimulated refugees going from Guangdong out all across Southeast Asia. Spain was a colonial power for a very brief time, 16 years or so in the north. It never left very much evidence of anything very important. The important occupation was the 38 years that Holland had colonized Fort Providencia, Fort Zeelandia down in the Tainan area, the area where I had done field work, and the area that was the breadbasket for Taiwan. It had a beautiful natural harbor, and this made it a splendid place. The story of Qing and his efforts to land here and drive the Dutch out is a fascinating story that we can't get into right now. If the year is 1650, then who would a person be? And I've called him Who by way of that bilingual joke. He would be a migrant from Fujian. He would be homesteading under the Dutch, hoping to go home back to Fujian rich. He would be a slayer of the savage Aborigines. He would have no sympathy for them at all. He would not be trading with them very much. He would mostly find that they were raiding him and he was raiding them. And in this region, he wouldn't be called Hu, which is a Mandarin name. He would actually be called Ho. And that shift between Mandarin and Fujianese dialects of Chinese is going to be politically significant. It's 1663, a little later. The Dutch have been driven out. He's a refugee driven from Fujian in a demolished coastal village because he was living on the coast, and they had that coastal evacuation, which lasted for several years before the emperor came of age and ended it. He was very, very, so defensive of his own people. He had to live with people who were from where he was from. He was very suspicious of people who talked funny, that is to say, who had other kinds of accents, whether in Fujianese or in Mandarin or in anything else. And he was a slayer of these Aborigines. This conflict was pervasive at that time. Now, these mainland immigrants came from all over the place. If you look at the top of the map there, you see all those little arrows going across, and they settled in different areas. And these areas were based on language, and language was based on dialects, which was based on region on the mainland. So here's a map of the Fujian, and I show this map and people go, oh my God, it's a heavily populated area. But let's make some sense of it easily. There is a long river in the south that flows down through a whole thing, and it constitutes a dialect area in itself with variants of this Jolong River dialect spoken in all of these places that are coming down here. Then that we can, and Zhangzhou is the big city down here. It's right here. We call it the Zhangzhou Alliance. There's another river up here, the Jin River. And coming down there, there are several tributaries to it, and there are villages which make up the Zhangzhou Alliance. These are the two groups that most hated each other throughout the 1700s and 1800s and were constantly making local war on each other. There are a few other groups that came in. Most of them were allied with the Zhangzhou people, but they were not directly part of the Jing River group. They tended to be part of the Zhangzhou Alliance. A third group that was involved with these squabbles that were constantly came from Guangdong province. This is Guangdong province. It's the one to the south of Fujian. And here there are people who speak a language called Hakka. It literally means the guest people. It's a little bit different from the normal dialects of Cantonese that are spoken across Guangdong. And they also migrated to Taiwan. And the town of the little settlement of Zhangping up in the north is also part of it. They're basically sort of four kinds of Hakka, and they all ended up in Taiwan in various places. These groups were, they tended to live together. They tended to be defensive against other people. The Zhangzhou Alliance was united, and one of the things that united them that interested me was the fact that they had a patron divinity. So temples were built, and these temples were centered around the cult of one or another patron divinity that had been a patron of the home district. So here we have some patron divinities for people in the Zhangzhou Alliance. Here we have some patron divinities, there are more of them, for the Zhengzhou Alliance. And because we had a couple additional types, sometimes called the Xiajiao group, they had their patron deities, and the Hakka had patron deities. Even today, if you go to Taiwan and you see a temple to Sanchang Guowang, for example, or Hanyu, it is going to be patronized largely by Hakka speakers. Although most Hakka speakers don't, I can't say most don't speak Hakka anymore. They don't speak Hakka very often. These affiliated divinities were used to make alliances between the various settlements in Taiwan. And that meant that religion in Taiwan always had a political aspect to it. Yes, you believed in the patronage of this deity. Yes, you prayed to this deity. Yes, you asked the deity for favors. Sometimes you gave gifts to the deity when to the deity's temples when the favors were granted. But there was always a kind of political edge to it. So it's 1840. We're late on in this. This person is named Ho. He is either a Hakka or he's one of these Zhengzhou or Zhangzhou groups. He's Hoklo, so-called, which is the cover term for those at the time. Then he's either a Zhangzhou or a Zhengzhou one. If he's a Hoklo, he's into Hakka bashing. If he's a Hakka, he's into Hoklo bashing. And nobody loves anybody very much. Then there are some unaffiliated deities, ones that are deities that govern everybody. Mazu, the goddess of the sea, is sometimes considered the patron goddess of Taiwan at the moment, and has been for a century and more. She was a very widespread goddess, and everybody could worship her. Guanyin, a Buddhist bodhisattva, would also have been worshipped by everybody. Guandi, who was a patron of contracts and brotherhoods, and I have a whole lecture on Guandi, I'm not going to go on about it, but all of these, and Koxinga, because he resisted the Qing government, were all sort of divinized as pan-Taiwanese objects of worship. So this temple thing turns out to be also the solution to reducing hostility and warfare, because you can have temple rituals which involve people from what would otherwise be hostile communities. By the late Qing Dynasty, things have calmed down. We have a little more exercise of centralized authority, although as you can see from this picture, it's pretty wild and woolly. We still have walled towns trying to defend themselves. Things are still pretty rough out there. During the Opium War, there was some attempt by foreigners to attack Taiwan. It didn't come to very much, but there was an issue of defending the homeland that increased central government interest in the place. These two pictures, it's hard to get old photographs because people didn't take a lot of pictures. We see the northern gate of Taipei City in 1882 on the bottom of the screen. We see the western gate in 1897. Both of these structures are still there. They've been rebuilt. They now have freeway underpasses and so forth going around them. But the wall itself became unnecessary. Things were calming down. In 1880, this is the office of the Taipei Magistrate. Remember, Taiwan is not yet a province, but it's under Fujian province. You have a central government. You can see that there was a magistrate there, guardians at the gate, and so forth and so on. A certain amount of industrialization was going on. By 1891, when it was already a province, it had a very progressive governor who was putting in railway. Notice the railway goes right through the gate. The gate is not doing the job. The wall is not doing a job anymore. The wall is going to get torn down and turn into boulevards and like other city walls around the world. Taiwan, by the 1890s, had more miles of railway than the rest of China put together. Governor Liu Mingchuan was very, very interested in trying to develop things. Now, what kind of industry could you develop? Well, you don't have much in the way of resources. It's an agricultural area. One of the first ones was the collection and drying of sea salt. And you can see that there would be wonderful little harbors. You can see in the upper map the chain of offshore islands. Mind you, this is a silty area. This is where that mountain flow off was flowing out from Taiwan. So this is going to silt up. The harbors are going to require constant dredging, but it's a perfect place to pull up salt, and you have flat areas where you can raise salt. So we have the beginnings of industrialization. This is 1887. The provincial magistracy, because it's now a province, has grown up. We have actual administration where the place is getting civilized. These Zhangzhou conflicts have faded. Part of it is due to the universalization of the pan-Chinese cults and of some pan-Taiwanese cults. On this map, you see the black dots, which are pretty much exclusively Taiwan worship, as opposed to the red dots that are pan-Chinese worship. But notice that they're all over the populated areas of Taiwan. We don't have much population in the mountains, so we don't expect to find temples up there particularly, but we find them all along here, and particularly down in this agricultural heartland. Religious activities of a local kind also are developing. These are things that respond specifically to events in Taiwan. Mr. Chen, who became a god in the right-hand picture, saved a whole lot of children from a disastrous flood that took place in Yunlin County in the southern Taiwan. And afterward, he became a local divinity. The whole thing is still commemorated in an annual flood demon expulsion ceremony over here. Everybody has a wonderful time. It's still going on. These flood demons and pacification of wandering spirits and so forth. This is all still going on. It's a local festival with purely local roots, strictly Taiwanese. This is not something that's pan-Chinese religion. The style of the thing, the desire to do the thing may be pan-Chinese, but this is a local cult. So Taiwan is developing its local identity, both very local and then for Taiwan as a whole as well. In 1895, the Emperor of China, as I said, turned Taiwan over to the Japanese. This was appalling. This was absolutely awful. And the magistrates in Taiwan were appalled at the whole idea that their own emperor would desert them. And briefly, a republic was established. In 1895, you see a postage stamp from it on the left. You see the flag of the Republic of the Taiwan Republic down underneath. And this republic was never really in control of much of anything. Indeed, the officers of the Republic fled to China in the fullness of time as the Japanese troops marched from the north to occupy this territory, which had been turned over to Japan. Why was it turned over to Japan? Well, Japan was a rising power and China had lost a war. Whoops. So in 1895, who is our friend Ho? Well, he is a would-be loyal subject of this wimpy Chinese emperor that turned over the whole island to the Japanese. He is not a subject of the goddamn Japanese emperor, but he doesn't have much choice. He's a reluctant Republican. There's no Republican ideology here. This is simply a matter of being caught in the middle. The whole issue of Zhangzhou conflict, Hakka bashing, the whole business has stopped being the issue. Taiwan suddenly has a fate that is entirely its own. It's been abandoned and turned over to this weird foreign country, this foreign emperor. So now we enter period 3, the period in which we are Japanese. The Japanese, suddenly confronted with an empire, are erecting Japanese shrines, Japanese buildings, the cult of the emperor. Don't forget that the emperor was becoming more and more divine through this period, and the military forces in Japan were growing. At the beginning, it wasn't that much, but eventually Japan was destined to invade the mainland, to invade Korea. And Taiwan was on the Japanese side in all of this. So it became very Japanese. Pictures we have of the Japanese period have Japanese style buildings, and Japan resolved to modernize Taiwan. There was anti-Japanese insurgency, lots of it. The most sort of bloodiest one was the so-called Dabani Incident in 1915. Those characters underneath the Chinese characters up here for Dabani are pretty local, which is what the little mouth in front of each character says. It's taking it from a name. It's a local name of a little village, which is now called Bamboo Garden Village. And the police pictures at the right show the rebels after they were captured and before they were executed. The Japanese, meanwhile, were transforming things. You have a picture of late Qing Dynasty, a street in late Qing Dynasty, Taipei, the Hanko Street. And then on the lower picture, you have what the Japanese turned it into, with a different style of architecture, a style really kind of borrowed from Europe. And it's a very European style, I've always thought. But you've gone from these individual shops, these sort of covered causeways, if you will, passages with shops behind them and people living on top. They're much higher. Notice the rural electrification. There's wires all over the place. Above is the train station. We have an actual train station at this point. To the lower picture is the high mountain trains, the mountain train that goes up to Alishan, which is the high mountain in southern Taiwan, which was put through during this Japanese period. And they're rather elegant trains. This is 1920, and here are first-class passengers. Looks like a train in many parts of the world. The farmer class are using the rural railroads, but those are designed to get crops to and from market and to deliver equipment to and from productive fields and so forth. We have industrialization really going on. The Baron Kodama Gentaro was the Governor General of Formosa, and he was not Governor General for very long, but he was very well respected, both by Japanese and by Taiwanese, who began almost immediately, except for the rebels, to see that things were getting better. Now, in the lower left-hand picture is the palace of the governor. He would have been the Governor General. He would never have lived in this building. This is a 1930 picture of it, and you can see that the administration buildings are getting more and more elaborate. This is the central, I can't call it a county exactly, section of the town, of the island, the Zhou, which was what the Japanese divided things into, in Taichung. Looks almost French in many ways. Here are some buildings that are still in use. The one at the left is the National Taiwan University Hospital. And it's only a little piece of the hospital. This is the old historic building part of the hospital. Look at the architecture. This is Japanese colonial architecture from the early 20th century. And the building on the right is usually called the Presidential Palace by Westerners. One wag called the architectural style Nippo Erectus, which I always liked, this huge tower. And it is today still the seat of the President of the Republic of China. But look at the architecture. This is the transformation into this funny Japanese colonial world of the early 20th century that is preserved in this. One of the things that it was a caste system. The Japanese were on top, the Chinese were on the bottom. And if anybody was lower than that, it was the Aborigines, who were largely living in reservations in the mountainous areas. The plains had been taken over by Chinese farmers. And the Japanese had the control positions. They ran the factories, they ran the schools, they ran everything. There were schools, and they were for boys, but there were schools. Everybody learned Japanese. Japanese was the official language. People were encouraged to change their surname to a Japanese surname. Initially, Taiwanese and Japanese were not permitted to marry because they were different castes. Eventually, they did come to be permitted to marry. And Taiwanese were encouraged to get more and more and more Japanese-like. And during the Second World War, as Japan was going to war and was becoming increasingly desperate, they were taking Taiwanese into the army. They never sent them to China because they didn't trust that, but they did send them to places like New Guinea. Many Taiwanese died in the South Pacific defending the Japanese side in the war. One of the areas that Taiwanese were able to assert equality with the Japanese in was baseball. Andrew Morris, from the graduate of our own history department, who's now on the faculty at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, has published a book about the history of baseball in Taiwan. Baseball played, again, a very political event. The lower picture actually shows statues of baseball players commemorating the role of baseball, because baseball was an area where Taiwanese were able to compete directly with Japanese, and they sometimes won. And when they went to Japan and played and won, what could be more wonderful? It showed that Taiwanese were just as good as Japanese. It was a very important kind of political symbol. After the end of the Second World War, when the mainland government came from China, baseball was still very strong, still very popular. The mainland Chinese coming were sort of puzzled by this whole thing. But we all remember Taiwan Little League and how it dominated world Little League. How it also had scandals about that. So it's 1938. Who is this whole person? No, his name is not Ho anymore. It's Tanaka or something like that. He's changed his name to a Japanese name. The path seems set for full Japanese citizenship for everybody in Taiwan. I haven't got it yet, but sort of hoping for it. Baseball has shown that Taiwan people are equal to the Japanese if you give them a chance. And there is still a tendency, kids were supposed to go to school and you bowed before a portrait of the emperor and you said Banzai. Unfortunately, in local dialect in Taiwanese, Pangsai means to defecate. And I have met people who went as little kids to school and bowed before the emperor and said, defecate, defecate. And the Japanese teachers thought that was very respectful unless they caught on to it. The kids were sometimes rather puzzled about it. I think it's very funny. The important thing here is the thrust toward Japanese-ness and people's growing conviction that they are Japanese. Now, I had a student who did a directed reading course with me. His grandmother had been born in 1938. She thought she was Japanese. And at the end of the Second World War, when it was time for all the Japanese to go back to Japan, those who were born in Taiwan had never been out of Taiwan necessarily. She thought she was supposed to be one of those and go back to Japan, which she'd never seen, as a Japanese. It was surprising to her that she turned out not to count as Japanese. She counted as Taiwanese. She was from a wealthy Taiwanese family, which had become completely assimilated to Japaneseness, complete with its surname. My student interviewed her. She was a very old lady, of course, and she was living in Bangkok. So with the wonders of Skype, I think he used, he was able to conduct a life history interview with his grandmother living in Bangkok, conducted in Japanese, because he was a student from Japan, about her life as a little girl in Taiwan under the Japanese. This generation born under the Japanese is all but disappeared at this point. I wish more UCSD students would talk to their grandparents. Most grandparents who have immigrated or parents who have immigrated have really interesting stories if their children and grandchildren would only ask about them. The Japanese period is still remembered, still commemorated. Sometimes this is a subway ticket, I believe, commemorating a character called Liao Tianding, who was a sort of a Robin Hood figure who robbed rich Japanese and gave the money to poor Taiwanese. The Cairo Declaration in 1943, when the war was on, agreed among the allies that all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, that's the words of the declaration, such as Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be returned to the Republic of China. This was confirmed in the Potsdam Proclamation in 1945, and the Republic of China, which had never as a government controlled Taiwan, took control of Taiwan in September of 1945. Initially, the Japanese were all set to surrender. There were no Chinese government officials to surrender to. It's a long story and an interesting one. This brings us to period 4, the Republic of China and the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party, the Republic of China, was effectively a one-party state, and the party was the Nationalist Party, called the Kuomintang or KMT, and they took over. It was not smooth going. Initially, Taiwanese were delighted to be Chinese again. Everybody had at least a hand-me-down memory of the Chinese emperor giving him to the Japanese emperor, and Japan had lost the war. And it had been a segregated society with Japanese on top. Suddenly, all these Taiwanese were suddenly going to be able to run factories, run the schools, run everything. That wasn't how it worked, because with the Nationalist Party and the Republic of China, they were fighting a civil war on the mainland that was going to go until 1949. By 1946, it was bubbling over. Kobe or Tanaka, or put your Japanese name in, anybody. At this point, everybody is going to be Chinese, and all Chinese are brothers. And that name Ho is not in Taiwanese. That's an ugly language. That's a regional thing. We have an official language now, an official national Chinese language. There'd never been an official national Chinese language until Republican times. And the Republic, you recall, had not come to Taiwan. So here it was. Suddenly Mandarin was the official language. I talked to a school teacher who said, we didn't know any Mandarin. How did we know Mandarin? All we could do was take classical Chinese texts and try to pronounce them in the most classical way we could and hope that it was sort of Mandarin-like. So you're not Ho anymore, you're Hu, and don't forget it. Nobody in free China is going to go around being named Tanaka. Japanese are the enemies of all good men. That expression, the Japanese are the enemies of all good men, is a phrase that I found in a tourist text, language book from that period. And the English here was given, and the Chinese equivalent, and it included the Japanese are the enemies of all good men as part of what you needed to know as phrases to use when on your visit to Taiwan. The other enemies of all good men, of course, are the communists. And suddenly there is this pronounced anti-communist sentiment that is being carried over from the Civil War on the mainland into Taiwan, as well as an anti-Japanese sentiment carried over by the mainlanders, who, after all, have just been fighting a war against Japan, which had infiltrated them. In February 28th of 1947, a lady selling illegal unlicensed cigarettes was arrested in Taipei. The event was protested by people around. It grew into a riot. The riot spread, and a lot of pent-up hostility to the arrogance and pushiness of the incoming troops and the incoming government turned into island-wide riots, lots of them. Expressions, and martial law was declared. Expressions of Taiwan, quote, independence were suppressed. Taiwan was part of the Republic of China, and don't you forget it, and we do not talk about Taiwan independence. The use of written Japanese suggests sympathy with the Japanese, who are the enemies of all good men, remember? Romanized Chinese was prohibited because it tended to be Romanized Hokkien, and remember, we have a national language, which is Mandarin, and censors can't read Romanized Chinese, so we need to have something that they can read. By 1949, this is a quick breakdown. April, the communists seized Nanjing. The government moves to Guangzhou. October, the government moves to Chongqing in Sichuan province. The following month, November, the government moves to Chengdu in Sichuan province because the communists have got Chongqing. The following month, in December, the government moves out of Sichuan province altogether to Taipei, which became the temporary capital of the Republic of China. If you want an American analogy, imagine that we had a huge civil war And the government in Washington was suddenly pushed out of Washington and ended up taking refuge in Puerto Rico, from which it planned to retake the mainland. And that was the position of the ROC government. After martial law was declared in 1947, there was a crackdown on everything. And throughout the period of martial law, and most of my field work was done under martial law, we had a strong domination of the president of the republic, Chiang Kai-Shek, who many of you remember. We see here a bronze statue of him with great respect that was out in the center of the National Museum of History in Taipei. The big building at the left, it's a beautiful building with all the ROC flags in front of it, which is definitely an assertion of political control. Probably has the largest actual functioning bronze doors on the face of the planet. These are huge. These are people up here, little tiny people. This thing is huge, with a big museum underneath of the life of Chiang Kai-shek. This was built after he died as a memorial to Chiang Kai-shek. It's a little embarrassing now, but it was respectful at the time. It was built on a site that had been cleared as a big Japanese military base. Okay. Mainland refugees had filled the positions that were vacated by the Japanese. Taiwanese had not had access to some of these control positions, and mainlanders often had experience. If you are a college professor on the mainland and you suddenly come as a refugee to Taiwan, your expertise as a professor of chemistry is valuable. If you were a person who was in the police force on the mainland, you know about a police force. The Taiwanese didn't necessarily, but they were resentful. By the mid-60s, the mainlanders were about 5% of the army, but they were 96% of the officer corps. Also, most of the teachers, most of the policemen, most of the bureaucrats, most of the heads of industry were mainlanders. And so what used to be a Zhangzhou conflict has disappeared. However, there's a conflict with the mainlanders. Meanwhile, the government is trying to appropriate all kinds of symbols. The symbol of Kaxinga, who had already become an object of devotion and even worship, suddenly becomes very important. The mainlanders love him. You see here a beautiful statue of the Dutch commander surrendering to Kaxinga. The original statue had him kneeling, and then the Dutch government objected. So Dutchmen don't kneel. So, all right, but the symbolism of somebody who was going to retake the mainland was so salient it couldn't be forgotten. Approved cults of human heroes were encouraged. Kaxinga, Confucius, Guandi, and of course you couldn't fight off the Buddhists. Everybody was a Buddhist. Even the Japanese had been Buddhists. So Guanyin, who was very popular. However, local religious things was opposed. And I still remember great signs in the countryside that said "smash superstition." And when I asked people, what is superstition? They said, oh, that's another word. That's a Mandarin word for religion. The local practice, to the extent it could be politicized, was sort of utilized in this notion that we're going to use all resources to retake the mainland. And all of these things that are spent on religious practice is money that could be spent retaking the mainland. Why are you doing this? Large crowds for large religious festivals like the one shown in this picture were regarded as a security risk. How do you finesse this from down below? The answer is you put a statue of Kaxinga in the temple and you claim that you were worshiping Kaxinga. Well, a large crowd worshiping Kaxinga is not a security risk, so that's okay. So in this particular ritual that you see here, it's a ritual to plague gods and the exorcism of plague gods. However, there was a statue of Kaxinga put in the temple, and that's what got it clearance to be able to have a large crowd. People finesse these things. It's now 1950. Who is this Ho person? Well, it's a bad idea to be named Ho. The Chinese quote, which meant Mandarin pronunciation, is Hu. Hu is a native of this province. We don't call him a Taiwanese. We call him a native of this province. It's hard for him to like the mainlanders, natives of other provinces. And that becomes, this native of this province and native of other provinces almost becomes a term of abuse. America, which has defended Taiwan against the communists and was on the side of the Republic of China during the war, is the best country in all the world. And all the Americans we know hate all communists. Just ask Senator McCarthy. He hates all communists. We all hate all communists. All that Zhangzhou Chen stuff doesn't matter. Hakka maybe aren't much good because they talk funny, but there are very few of them. Don't worry about it. Those hostilities are gone. New tensions have arisen. Land reform. Now, the nationalists here got busy doing a lot of very useful things. They produced the most successful land reform ever. They distributed the land to the people who were tilling it. And you had to be able to till the land to get it. But the former landlords were not killed off the way they were in the mainland. They were given bonds that were to be paid from the revenue of the land, and the tillers of the land were required to pay back the land by paying the interest on the bonds. So the money was going on a long-term sort of lend-lease program to the tillers. From this, the landlords were being paid, and they were given bonds. Sweet potato bonds were particularly famous, but bonds in lots of commodities. Some of them sold them, and that was fine. They could sell them if they wanted to. Some of them held them. It was much better in the long pull to hold them because they turned out to be much more valuable than people thought they were. People had a notion that this whole thing was going to collapse anytime. It didn't. It throve. And the former landlords were not able to invest in land, which was a traditional Chinese investment to preserve wealth. So what can you invest in? And the answer is you can invest in industry. And industry throve. Initially, these were cheap, cruddy little things. You can have, with low investment, you can produce plastic shoes. So they produced plastic shoes, but gradually, through assisted by all kinds of very benevolent and enlightened legislation, more and more sophisticated stuff began to be produced. When I was first working in Taiwan, you couldn't buy a toothbrush that didn't have the bristles fall out. Today, Taiwanese products are powering sophisticated electronic stuff around the world. Education was expanded. It was very dramatic. When I looked at the census forms for the village that I worked in, little girls started going to school immediately upon the arrival of the national government. By 1948, all little girls were in school, just the same way little boys were. The expansion of education was spectacular, and it really paid off. It was really impressive. In 1979, I call it the Axe Falls, France, Japan, and the United States decided that the government of the Republic of China was not ever going to be the government of the whole of China. And they switched their diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing and recognized the People's Republic of China as the government of all of China. Why all of China? Why is Taiwan not cut out? Because the People's Republic of China wouldn't accept that, and neither would Taiwan. The mainland threatened military invasion if Taiwan declared itself to be independent from China. That threat is still there. The Republic of China therefore ceased to be a government in exile, as it had been up until then, but it couldn't be a country. There's a small number of states in the world today. Guatemala just switched from Taipei to Beijing. Nauru has just switched. Very small number of states that recognize the ROC as the government of all of China. Those are your only choices. Recognize one, recognize the other. It is not yet possible to recognize them both. That's very hard. Backing up, 1980, who is who now? Well, the nationalists have become stateless for practical purposes. The restive non-mainlanders who were chafing under mainlander political domination are beginning to see the mainlanders who are immigrants are dying off and retiring, but the mainlander kids are not necessarily inheriting those positions. Taiwanese are getting those positions, and in political cases, being Taiwanese was a reason why people would vote for you as opposed to your being a mainlander. Meanwhile, the economy was thriving. People were able, after the end of martial law, to travel. Everybody ends up with relatives in America. And all of the ROC nationals, everybody living in Taiwan is in the same boat. The mainlander Taiwanese distinction has become kind of irrelevant. In the United States, the analysts of this, the American social scientists, wanted to see mainlander Taiwanese conflict as being a big deal. It stopped being a big deal. Everybody is in the same boat. And there's nothing like living under the same institutions and being in the same boat for those conflicts to be much less important. Taiwan's population today, or as of 2020, which was the most recent census, was about 23, almost 24,000. That's about 60% of California's population. And you can see in the curve that it's leveling off a little bit. I don't know where it's going to end up in the long pull, but it grew. And if you look at the bottom part, 1905 is the first Japanese census. And if you look at the end of the war, about here, the population is much higher now. This has been a squeeze on agricultural land. It's been possible only because of rapid urbanization. Taipei, which we saw last time as this little tiny outlying thing with a little city wall in the Qing Dynasty, we saw it 150 years ago, or 100 years ago as the new Japanese thing. It became a major metropole. This is 1987. This is the end of martial law. This is 1987, and there's a McDonald's, Ronald McDonald sitting on the top of a new McDonald's because McDonald's was opening every few weeks. There was a new McDonald's in Taipei. Those old Qing Dynasty houses, which were still around at that time, were largely replaced in the post-war period by two-story concrete things rapidly expanding, then to be replaced after that with higher ones. And now one finds higher ones yet. And these are not even the latest. The one on the left is slated for destruction. The one on the right is the kind of house which is likely to follow it. That's what Taipei is full of today. It's a very complex modernity. There's a pride in a Chinese background. This is the Sannyasen Memorial at the right. It was very much a product of the national government moving here. But in the background, you see these modern high-rise buildings rising all around Taipei. There is a distinct sense that there is a tradition here. Night markets are no longer just out on the street, however, they're confined in some ways, but they are very much a tradition that is being followed. This is the art of daily life, is going out and enjoying the night market with your friends and going out and nibbling little things. Religious exuberance with prosperity has come a great deal of expenditure on temples. The roof on the right, it's a typical temple roof in Taiwan. And this is an extravagance, a Rococo exuberance that one did not see previously in Chinese history because nobody had the money to do it. There's been some introduction of other religions, Catholicism, it's a Catholic church on the left. Notice how Chinese it is, how Sinified it is, how Taiwanese it is. Temples, little temples, big temples, all of them elegant, clean, well-swept, growing up all over. At the same time, we see a modern street that's cut off the front of this old temple because modernity is in competition for land with these things. Traditional values, filial piety and the like were thrown into relief in this period. All of a sudden, the traditional Chinese moral tracts were very important. And cults grew up that were focused on morality. They were divination cults. They were cults of liturgies of various kinds. The picture on the right you see is from an animated life-size representation of the courts of hell where people go to be judged after death. And yes, that guy is being lowered into a cooking wok. This is an old text. I have it on my webpage, in fact, of what happens to people who are bad and why it is that you have to be good. The picture on your left side of your screen is a new temple, not all that now new anymore. I took the picture some 15 or 20 years ago, of a religious society invented in order to propagate morality. A patron cult still exists for some of these old groups, particularly the Hakkas. Hanyu is a patron of Hakkas, and there's his temple, a traditional temple, but they are worshipped by almost everybody these days. However, there's some assertions of ethnic identification. The Hakkas who used to be kind of apologetic about being Hakka are now proud of being Hakkas. They're not fighting with the Hoklo anymore. They're having calligraphy contests. They're having traditional Hakka speech contests. And they're having, there's an assertion of a kind of ethnicity that's a much friendlier thing than it used to be. Life after martial law brought about the opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, which actually captured the presidency. It brought about extravagant press freedom, which was often abused. It brought about foreign travel. Lots of Taiwanese come to the United States now. It brought about the open discussion of independence almost forever, almost all the time. This whole business of bashing Hakkas and Zhengzhou and Zhangzhou is all ancient history. Unification bashing is what is politically correct, and people talk about unification on and on and on, and people talk against it. We have an active multi-party democracy here with two main parties and their hangers on as clusters of parties, but lots of vigorous campaigning. We have a continued building of an economic base. This is Taipei 101. It was for a time the highest building in the world. This is built on a place that has an earthquake every 3 days. This is built on a place with a very high water table and a subway below the water table of Taipei. Nevertheless, these engineering feats have been done in Taiwan with Taiwanese architects, Taiwanese engineers. This place has been fabulously successful. Taipei 101 is sort of like it makes the whole city a sort of a big sundial with this as its center. Civil rights of all kinds, human rights, gay marriage is now legal in Taiwan. The whole notion of the assertion of civil and civic rights is very much a part of the scene. The arts scene has been very active. This is the Museum of Modern Art. And it was astonishing to me who would have imagined 100 years earlier that Taiwan, of all places, would have a Museum of Modern Art, but it does. What are the artists doing? Well, some of them are nostalgic about the change. Here's a little village scene. There's the building of high rises in what used to be agricultural land. This is not surprising, but artists being critical is part of this whole thing. This is called dead fields. It's part of this artistic criticism of the very modernization of which it is a part. Sculpture, theater, film, novels, so many books are published in Taiwan that it's hard to keep them in print because they move off the shelves. You've got to make room for new books. For a long time, Taiwan was publishing more books per capita, or had fewer people per title, than any other place in the world. The publication rate was simply spectacular. And Taiwan continues to be a place which is a trendsetter for styles all across Asia. Now, in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, there was an opening up to the mainland, and one got some religious pilgrimages going to the mainland, going to religious sites on the mainland, where I took these pictures of Taiwanese tourists at a Guandi temple in Zhangzhou, which was Guandi's home stomping ground. People made temples. Mazu is important in Taiwan, as I mentioned, and so people made pilgrimages there, even though there's lots of Mazu temples in Taiwan. Continuing expansion of these cults. So it's 2010. So who is this who then in 2010? Well, if he's pro-independence, then everybody who lives in Taiwan is Formosan. He's not Chinese, and is pronounced Ho. What was this who business? That's Chinese, Mandarin. We're pro-independence now. We want it to be Hokkien. If he's not pro-independence, then he's a globalist. Either way, he speaks all or mostly Mandarin. He lives in a city. He has some relatives in America. He's visited the mainland possibly. He has no interest in all these old Zhengzhou, Zhangzhou, Hakka. What is all that? He likes sushi, he likes karaoke, but he thinks Japanese are a little weird and it's another country. There is no notion that we are Japanese. There's been a kind of a growth, I think, in imitation of American styles of abo chic, if you will, a movement cultivating Taiwanese tradition as independent from mainland tradition, and some attempts to promote, as under the name Taiwanese Hoklo, in a kind of a generalized thing. 2022, right now, he calls himself Taiwanese. He's bilingual. He speaks more Mandarin than Taiwanese. He probably named Hu in Mandarin and Ho in Taiwanese, and he doesn't care anymore. He lives in a city. He has relatives in America. He has others doing business on the mainland. All that old factionalism is gone. We still like sushi and karaoke. We are not nostalgic for the Japanese period. He has spent his whole life under the threat of war with China. Since the Chinese crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, he has become more strongly pro-independence. And it has made the whole one country, two systems slogan of Hong Kong an unviable idea in Taiwan. Here are some cartoons that bring us up to date on this political shadow lying over Taiwan. This is from the Taipei Times, which is affiliated with the Democratic Progressive Party and its sympathies. And here is a Chinese official coming to be nice to the Taiwanese. And there's been all kinds of mainland proposals for trade relations across the straits. There have been periods in recent history when you can travel back and forth. There have been links between air links and postal links between Taiwan and the mainland that were set up a decade ago when it looked much more promising. But these relations are deteriorating. This satirical cartoon is showing the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, the one that was the party of Chiang Kai-Shek, the one that was going to retake the mainland, as kowtowing in wanting to have closer relations with the mainland. And the DPP is the one that says you just can't trust these mainlanders. You can't trust that government. Closer relations are just going to mean domination. There was a proposal for practically a kind of free trade zone along the coast, all kinds of closer relations. Finally, in 2014, there was a reaction against it, and there was a so-called Yellow Umbrella movement in which college students took over the National Assembly and they protested and finally succeeded in killing the proposal to agree with the mainland for closer economic relations. The grounds were that closer relations were going to mean greater domination, and domination was eventually going to mean the loss of any possibility of independence in Taiwan, its assimilation into the mainland on mainland terms. And the Hong Kong situation made that worse. Cartoon here, if you can't read it on your screen, says, "What are you looking at? I'm enjoying the amiable cross-strait relationship, and I know exactly where I'm going." This is the old KMT posing against the DPP, these two political parties with their difference in how they see it. Here is another détente picture. This is from Radio Free Asia, which is hardly a left-wing rag, I suppose. Come home, Wan Wan. Wan Wan stands for Taiwan. It says Mama Mainland. Enjoy the same treatment as your mainland compatriots. Where? Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, the states from 2019. Here's one from the Japan Times. Notice in Japan now. And again, the same view. Reunification with China. But what's the China? The proposal is peaceful. Look at all those missiles that are attached to this dragon. This is what you're in. Taiwan is sitting in a place where a great, big, powerful country next door, ever more powerful, is saying, gonna get you, gonna get you, gonna get you. And only somebody sits there saying, gonna get you, gonna get you, gonna get you. You have a sense that there's a possibility you're gonna get got. And so it is. Will the United States come in? This cartoon from New Taiwan magazine says, don't worry, I can keep him at bay for a while with arms sales to Taiwan. But little Taiwan, great big China, how long is that going to hold? Here is, this is from an outfit called Pritchett Cartoons. I found it on the internet. I do not know where it was originally published, but we see China consuming Taiwan to the consternation of surrounding countries. And the latest issue of The Economist that came out this week talks about China's desire to take Taiwan partly to break the chain that encloses Taiwan of other countries around the Pacific. I think that's a false argument because you can sail through all of these places. Nevertheless, it can be seen that way. People do see it that way. Here we have Joe Biden as president. China's one China policy is not confusing. There's one China based in Beijing. that better keep its hands off the other China based in Taiwan. This is the status quo. This is an unstable thing, and everybody in Taiwan lives under this. You don't know what's going to happen. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have this cartoon from the week, and here's little Taiwan sitting there on China's lap, reading about the Russian-Ukraine invasion. And everybody in Taiwan is watching to see what happens. What is the message that Xi Jinping is going to get from this? We don't know. We don't know where it's going. So who will who be tomorrow? Well, he'll probably still be who if he may not be alive, or it may be perfect. Who knows? It's very hard to tell. Okay, that's the end at last. You thought there'd never be an end. And if you want more China stuff, I have a gigantic website that is full of stuff that I have made for classes on all kinds of subjects, on lots of things, including the making of the modern world. And there's old Roman texts, all kinds of things. One big section of it is China-related resources, which is linked from this side, which is the main page, and you can take it over here, and there's lots and lots of stuff there. So with that, I'm done at last.
David, this was a wonderful presentation, really, really interesting. Before I open it up to everyone else, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question, and that is in regards to the Aboriginal communities in the mountains that you mentioned, back in the history period. What has ever happened with those Aboriginal communities? Do they still exist as reservations per se, a la American version, or have they integrated?
At the end of the Japanese period, the national government inherited that whole system and that administration. The Japanese had sometimes moved them around in the mountains, depending on where they wanted land. And so many of these communities were put with people with whom they did not have a common language. They end up using Japanese as their trade language, and that persisted well into the 1960s and 70s. There was also a greater penetration of Protestant missions during the Japanese period into those areas. The Aborigines tended to be more receptive to Protestant Christianity than Chinese were. And so a lot of them are actually Christians. With the coming of the national government, these communities were assimilated as well as possible. And the interesting expression, high mountain brethren, and the term for brethren here was people of the same womb. And it always struck me as a funny expression, because if they were so different from Chinese, kind of ethnically, but that was the expression. It was a polite expression, the same womb people. With the end of martial law and the coming of all kinds of political liberalization, many of these groups have had, what will I say? I won't say liberation movements. They weren't really ever enslaved exactly. They are movements of ethnic assertion. And so you now find museums of Aboriginal life. You find the commemoration of lots of these groups in art. You find an increased value of artifacts that are made by these groups. There still are villages, not really towns, but villages in the areas traditionally associated with these groups. But they are clearly a part of Taiwanese society, but they're a very small number of people. So it's not a huge group. It's a few hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million at most. And there has been, a great celebration of Aboriginal Taiwanese life that's come up in the last few years.
Thank you.
The whole island is full of museums. It's full of lots of really interesting museums, and a lot of these museums have ended up with Aboriginal sections too.
Thank you. Jake, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. I was wondering if there's any information about what an average Chinese middle-class citizen might think about the issue of reunification, and whether they would support a Chinese invasion and going to war.
Of Taiwan? or on the mainland? I don't know.
On
about
the mainland. The
I don't-
average Chinese person.
Well,
on
you know, the
mainland.
mainland government has not made any effort ever to suggest even the possibility of Taiwan independence. And so if you travel in Fujian, you find posters and so forth about the Taiwan as part of the mainland. If you buy any kind of an atlas or something on the mainland, Taiwan is simply another province. And there has been no attempt to condition the mainland population to the possibility of Taiwan independence. We have lots of examples around the world of a language community that is not confined to a single political entity. Austria and Germany are separate countries and they both speak German. It doesn't require that they all be part of Germany, maybe unless you're Hitler. And there are lots and lots of Spanish-speaking countries. They don't all have to be part of the same country. So one could make an argument that Taiwan could have that kind of a relationship with the mainland. At the United Nations, when the United Nations was founded in order to get the Soviet Union cooperatively in there, two of its republics were given separate status in the United Nations. One was Ukraine, and the other one was, I don't remember. And they had delegates that sat beside the Soviet delegates throughout the Soviet period. So the Soviet Union was double represented. When Malaysia was admitted to the United Nations, the Soviet Union wanted to have a communist state admitted at the same time, and Mongolia was admitted at the same time as Malaysia, even though Mongolia was officially part of the Republic of China, and the Republic of China held the Chinese seat in the United Nations. So the United Nations even has a precedent of double representation to solve some of these political problems. There's no reason Taiwan, even if it were still claimed by the mainland, couldn't be in the United Nations as far as those precedents are concerned. But there's also no reason that the mainland couldn't accept Taiwan as a separate country. There was a time when the national government in Taiwan hoped to retake the mainland. I can remember when I went to graduate school that there were occasional bumper stickers on cars that said "Unleash Chiang Kai-Shek." And the notion was if it hadn't been for the Americans preventing him crossing the Taiwan Straits, he would have retaken the mainland long since. There were plans to retake the mainland. It just, that didn't happen. Part of it was the interference of the Korean War. But from the mainland perspective, the population has not been conditioned at all to the possibility of Taiwan independence. Meanwhile, with each passing year, people in Taiwan are more and more convinced that Taiwan independence is what they want. If that was at the end of the Second World War, when the national government moved, there were about 2 million people, I guess, that came to Taiwan. And of a population of maybe 10 million people in total, 2 million were from the mainland, and they all had hopes of reconquering the mainland and going back. The rest of them didn't care about it. They didn't oppose it as long as it wasn't going to cost them very much. At this point, I don't think there's anybody in Taiwan that really thinks they're going to retake the mainland. But the question is, what will happen to them if the mainland takes them? And independence seems like the happiest possible solution if you're in Taiwan. Now, with the Ukraine war, one of the things that's happening, it seems to me, is that if Russia conquers Ukraine, it's going to have a basket case on its hands. Who wants to take over a resentful population, such of it as is left, and a destroyed industrial base? What is there in Russia for that? Similarly, if mainland China attacked Taiwan, the cost would be so great. And what you would get would be a resentful population in a destroyed industrial base, probably, if you had to do it militarily. So if I were on the mainland side and I wanted to take Taiwan, I would try and figure out how to do it diplomatically.
Thank you. Figures.
I just wondered whether Taiwan is arming itself or whether the United States is arming it.
Mostly it's arming itself. We were arming it. We quit arming it back, late 60s or so, when we withdrew all of our forces and so forth. After that, what we have done is sell them arms. And so the question is, when something goes through Congress, it isn't to give Taiwan armaments, it's to sell them arms. And this is the military industrial complex. We're making money on it.
Dr. Jordan, is Japanese still taught as a major language or important language in Taiwan? And are Japanese still considered the enemies of all good men?
Oh, that was a carryover from the mainland population coming from mainland, who had just been fighting a war against the Japanese occupiers. And the Japanese were not very friendly occupiers. Taiwan was on the Japanese side there. And so when the mainland government moved, they were very afraid of Japanese sympathizers, of whom there were some. And I remember a movie that was produced in the 60s that took place with two Taiwanese under the Japanese period. Boy and a girl fall in love, but they have the same surname, and therefore they can't marry, but they flee to Japanese occupied Tianjin, where the custom allows them to get married under the same surname. And they have the advantage that they can speak Japanese and Chinese, and they can be sort of mediators in Japanese occupied Tianjin. This is, this was a daring movie at the time. During the 1950s and 60s, Japanese was still taught in college. You could take it as a foreign language, the same way you could take French or German. Nobody was encouraged to do so. It was driven out of the public education system, which went immediately to Mandarin. Today, there's a certain, Japan is a big, interesting, important country right next to Taiwan. And it's a place where there's lots of Japanese tourists that come to Taiwan, so it's convenient to learn some Japanese. Sometimes people think that because they both use Chinese characters, it's going to be easy. It's easier for Chinese maybe to learn Japanese than it is for us, but it isn't easy. It's an entirely unrelated language. But it's taught as a foreign language. And probably it wouldn't surprise me if English is the first foreign language that people study. If they're going to pick another one to study, the chances are pretty good it's likely to be Japanese. But it could equally well be Spanish.
Sure, thank you. It's interesting. I have a really close friend who is Taiwanese, and their family, they're very, very involved with business between mainland China and Taiwan. And I'm wondering if, in fact, these kinds of business and commercial linkages are just making it that much more stable. They're all getting used to doing business together and getting along and becoming more enmeshed that way.
Under the sort of program of linking Taiwan economically to China and so forth in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of Taiwanese investment in the mainland. Mainland labor was cheaper than Taiwan labor. And so it was not surprising that there were Taiwanese factories setting up in the mainland. And I was surprised there were something like 2 million Taiwanese business, or is that right? 500,000 Taiwanese businessmen in Shanghai. And they actually were founding a Taiwanese hospital in Shanghai and things. It was amazing that you had that big a population of Taiwanese immigrants doing business there. The same way you have lots of Taiwanese immigrants doing business in Vietnam. We had a graduate student who was studying the entrepreneurship in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, you must be a Vietnamese national to own certain resources and factories and so forth. So the Taiwanese would marry a Vietnamese national, in addition, perhaps, to a wife in Taiwan. And there may be some of that going on with the mainland as well. At this point, I think, especially since the crackdown in Hong Kong, there was a time when the Hong Kong formula, when it was new, and people said, oh, well, you can, one country, two systems, it can be all we will care about is the flag. When that seemed a viable possibility, it just doesn't seem viable. The crackdown in Hong Kong really has had a tremendous impact in Taiwan. And some people were suspicious altogether. I'm trying to find it was when they had looking on my other computer here for the actual date. The Sunflower Student Movement that occupied the Legislative Yuan in order to protest the cross-strait ties was in 2014, in March of 2014 through April of 2014. The cross-strait trade agreement had been proposed in 2013. It was negotiated between the governments of Taiwan and China with the intent of simplifying investment in that area and of business travel in between. And it sounded very positive. And it was really resisted by these student activists who were motivated by a fear that somehow the mainland was just going to dominate Taiwan economically. I think they were right. It would. And it would have increased the domination of Taiwan. It might be, however, that that's the most peaceful resolution we're going to get.
Right. Professor Jordan, this has been absolutely fabulous. We have all learned so much, and we thank you sincerely for your wonderful class.
One resource that's related to Taiwan, if you go onto the website, I put the address at the top and go to China-related resources. There is a section on Taiwan, and it includes a blow-by-blow, year-by-year chronology of Taiwan. It was illustrated largely by a student I had who drew beautiful watercolor pictures of stages in Taiwan history as a special project that has its own story. But if you're interested, it's a resource that relates directly to Taiwan. Has this breakdown from the beginning to the present, to the response to COVID, to the present situation. So that's available.
Thank you so very much. Really appreciate it. This was really spectacular. Thank you all for attending. Take care.